Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining in, everyone. Hope your Monday's going well. I'm Tyler Williams. I'm an extension educator for University of Nebraska. I'm located in Lincoln. Today, you're joining the webinar on bioenergy and ecosystem services. Today, we have Dr. David Ripplinger with us from North Dakota State University Extension. We're excited to have him. David is a bioenergy and bioproduct economics specialist and assistant professor in the Department of Ag Business and Applied Economics at NDSU. In these roles, David conducts research and provides support to farmers in the bioenergy industry. Today, he'll share a little bit about the current social, economic, and political situation as it pertains to biofuels and ecosystem services and what to expect moving forward. And this probably looks different now than when we first talked a couple months ago, David. So, but before I turn it over, I want to go ahead and let you all know that a poll question will pop up here in a minute, and I'll leave that open for a few minutes until we get everyone able to respond to that. And I'll also have a second one at the end if you wanted something to look forward to. So if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to type them into the chat box or the Q&A. I'll monitor that, and so unless something is pressing within that, I'll go ahead and leave the questions till the end, and we'll definitely do some Q&A. So with that, I'm gonna stop my part and go ahead and turn it over to David and see if he's able to keep up on this world of ever-changing bioenergy. So David, I'll go ahead and let you share your screen and you can take it from there.
Great, thanks, Tyler. A little bit of technical difficulty the last second there. We'll go ahead and get this going. That's not what I want to show. Okay, so if you guys can see my screen here, are we up?
Yep, I see it. You're good.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks, Tyler. Sorry about that. Yeah, and thanks for the introduction, and probably most importantly, thanks for the invitation. You guys are doing a lot of cool things with the North Central Climate Collaborative. I've been fortunate to be involved to some extent, kind of as time allows, to actually really become a larger part of my work the last 4 or 5 years, thinking about climate, thinking about carbon, thinking about how that relates to production agriculture specifically, as well as business opportunities. Just a little bit of a background about me. So my job actually came about 15 years ago to help work in this space, primarily looking at how are we going to commercialize cellulosic ethanol, which was driven in large part by carbon, which was driven by climate and concerns about it. And that's really not what's happened in my position. It's actually been quite a bit different. One of the things I'd also bring up is that I'm not an ecosystem services expert. I come from my training as an agricultural economist and working with farmers and other agriculturalists to build new businesses, to find ways to be profitable as well as sustainable. And so, I become well-versed enough to be dangerous on that side of things, but really work closely with folks who see the opportunities on the commercial side, which I think is really important for all of us working in agriculture, because it's always good to have a number of reasons to make positive changes. And so I usually lean more on the economics profitability side and work with a number of other folks throughout the ag science discipline more broadly defined. Just to talk a little bit too about my position, even though that I came from the cellulosic space, I've really come more and more to work into this ecosystem services side of things. Again, because that's really what biofuels are about, outside of energy security and rural economic development, which are certainly very important. The idea that if we do things differently, that we can have these positive impacts on the environment. And biofuels initially and still is dominated by this idea that we can do things that, achieve what we want to, which in the case of transportation fuels is move around, either people or freight, and treat the environment better. In this case, fewer greenhouse gas emissions, which I'm going to call carbon emissions, kind of back and forth, kind of interchangeably. And, we can do both of these things well. And so that's really kind of the space where I'm at and really where I'm coming from. So I'm going to kind of walk through a few things that have kind of been ongoing in bioenergy as they relate to and get to this broader idea of ecosystem services. So I hope I'm assuming most of you have heard about the RFS, or the Renewable Fuel Standard. So that's the federal policy, the national policy that mandates biofuel use by type and year. And a lot of what I've done in the last 15 years, again, hasn't been cellulosic ethanol, but has been working with other, what we call advanced biofuels, getting those approved by EPA so that they can be sold commercially in the United States and be recognized because they have a smaller carbon intensity, same thing as a carbon footprint or a greenhouse gas footprint. The RFS really has been the dominant force until recently in driving investment in bioenergy, but it's certainly not the only thing. Now, one thing really important to bring up too is, these new biofuels that are brought on board, they have to go through this pretty rigorous process with EPA, and I've been involved in that. And that really goes through having the carbon or greenhouse gases that are emitted with the production and use of a certain fuel being measured really accurately and precisely and achieving certain thresholds. And within the RFS, there's different types. So you're either in a specific basket or you're not. You achieve a certain threshold for carbon emissions or you don't. And so that drives a lot of the work, or had driven a lot of the work in a certain way, including the work that I had done with various feedstocks. Again, cellulosic kind of has its own carve out. Biodiesel has its own carve out. The advanced biofuel space where I worked were for those feedstocks and fuels that hadn't been kind of grandfathered in, that had a spot existing for them. So it would require going through this process of calculating carbon intensity. So not to go too far into environmental LCAs, but one of the things that I had to do, NDSU is a great land grant university, but our bench isn't quite as deep as some of our peers, is I had to become a relative expert on conducting environmental life cycle assessment, which you may or may not be familiar with. Again, it's this rigorous way, this standardized way of measuring environmental impacts. Again, from my perspective in biofuels, it's almost entirely carbon-based. It's entirely greenhouse gas emission-based, because that's really the driver. It's all about, what are your emissions relative to gasoline? And at the federal level, that's really how they determine which bucket you go into. So for example, a conventional biofuel has a reduction of about 20%. Hey, Katie or Tommy, can you come get Carly, please? Come get your little sister. So we have this conventional biofuel with a reduction of about 20%. That's corn ethanol. It's not called corn ethanol, but it's any biofuel that has that type of reduction. Next, we have these advanced biofuel space, which is actually a bunch of them. This includes cellulosic, it includes biodiesel for those uses. And that's also this point where we want to hit. And again, it's any fuel that achieves that 50% threshold or more. If you make it, you're an advanced biofuel, you have certain competitive advantages in the marketplace. The graph or the table I have on the side there is actually a little bit dated, but was the table that EPA first put out almost a decade ago, saying, okay, tell us about how you produce your feedstock. What does it look like? What does it take in terms of inputs to produce it, in terms of operations to produce it? And then most importantly, back it up. EPA, if you had a chance to work with them, like USDA, very science-driven organization. They have certain charges that come from, laws passed by Congress, and then they promulgate a number of regulations and then, execute on those regulations as part of the executive branch. What they want and what they've always done within the RFS is saying, okay, this is something new, prove it. And your proof is going to be driven by science. And so some of this is driven by research you might do at a land grant university, might be done by consultants, but having evidence, having peer-reviewed research is actually really fundamental to EPA and how they operate. And now as it's kind of gone beyond just EPA to state and other countries, you see that science really does drive things, which is really kind of fun, because that's why a lot of us went into science, is to make a difference. No, I can't. Yep. So just going on to the next slide, talk a little about California. So California is where things have gotten really interesting. So the federal government was first and foremost with the RFS about 15 years ago. And now with the low carbon fuel standard, we'd see California kind of pick up the mantle and show a lot of leadership in this space. Some of that, and actually most of it, is the result of the current administration not being overly supportive of biofuels. And California is saying, okay, if it's not going to happen in Washington, we're going to do it from Sacramento, for better or worse. So California's low carbon fuel standard is really important to understand, and kind of the core policy feature, which is driving a lot of what's going on in carbon markets, nationally, internationally, and looking at even beyond carbon. And so what California did is say, hey, let's create a cap and trade system. If we have folks who have to document how much carbon is in the transportation fuel they market and have it at a certain level or below, we can continually drive ever declining use or release of carbon in our system. So each year what they do is they say, here's the level that everybody has to achieve. Those obligated parties, blenders and refiners, wholesalers, have to achieve that level. And if they do a little bit better, they can trade some credits. If they don't quite make it, they can go into the market and buy those credits. And again, by doing this, it's a really great policy innovation or mechanism. We've seen it a lot. EPA has done this a lot in a number of environmental markets, with mercury and sulfur and all of those things. California said, hey, let's do it for carbon and for biofuels. And it's worked really, really well. What's important about this is now that it's become so big, that it has really driven innovation across the bioenergy space. So I'm in North Dakota. We have a relatively fair-sized corn ethanol industry in the state, not as big as Nebraska or Iowa or a lot of the other north central states, but certainly a major user of the crops that we grow. And what we've seen is, because the market in California is large, it's 10% of the fuel market, we now sit back and we can say they're pushing lower carbon fuels, which corn ethanol is. They're incentivizing that. So they're saying, hey, send your corn ethanol to us, we'll use it. And if you can have corn ethanol that's even just slightly more environmentally friendly, in this case has a smaller greenhouse gas footprint, we'll pay you for it. Again, because they have to, across the entire system, achieve ever declining levels. It's not a bucket like RFS, it's ever declining levels. Those blenders and refiners, the folks who buy fuel, either from Exxon or from your local corn ethanol refinery, they'll pay on the margin for that slightly better, environmentally friendly fuel. And so that's really outstanding, because it does exactly what we wanted to do, saying, hey, here's a price signal, go innovate. We don't care how you do it, but we want to have fuel with less carbon. Corn ethanol says, hey, we have that. So initially they got paid, but what's really neat is that now corn ethanol refineries, be they in Nebraska or North Dakota or elsewhere, can continually innovate, reduce their greenhouse gas footprint, go through a small process with California and their Air Resources Board, and essentially be immediately financially rewarded for reducing that greenhouse gas footprint. That's fantastic. That's what we want. That's one part of it. Another really important part of this is that the financial incentives are more than enough to incentivize folks to do this. A lot of these metrics might not be familiar to you, but in the last year and a half, the price of carbon in California has been about $200 a metric ton, which is a lot of money. My rule of thumb that I had up until this kind of took off is, if you can pay me $20 a metric ton, I'm going to listen. And now we're an order of magnitude higher, which makes a lot of individuals, engineers, refinery owners, look at all of these ways in which they can reduce carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions throughout their supply chain to capture some of that value that the state of California provides with their policy. Probably the most important thing outside of California is that other states and other countries look at them and say, hey, their policy works. Most nations of the world have ascribed to the Paris Accord, saying, hey, we're going to work to reduce carbon emissions. We know that the transportation industry uses up about a third of our energy and is associated with about a third of our carbon emissions. So they went and said, well, how can we do this? And they said, hey, California's system works. So the best example of this is the nation of Brazil. They've essentially adopted California's model, lock, stock, and barrel. Provinces in Canada, the British Columbia and Quebec have very similar policies. Oregon and Washington have adopted similar policies. The state of New York has a similar policy, again, because they all go to California and say, hey, you figured this out, you've proven it, and also important is we can kind of piggyback on all the hard work you did. You've created all of this policy that we can adopt, lock, stock, and barrel, instead of having to go through and writing all these new policies and seeing if they work and getting sued in federal court to see if it's defensible constitutionally, and actually developed a market that functions like it should. And so that is really, really helpful kind of as we see things kind of build out. And again, in part, it goes back to the RFS starting things, but not going as far as some people wanted. An individual state, per its prerogative, just said, hey, we're more concerned about carbon than the rest of the country is. So, hey, we're going to create policy to incentivize that type of thing. And now other states and nations adopting it. And again, maybe the most important thing for our conversation today is that we're really looking at, what does this mean in terms of North American, especially US agriculture, and how do we actually do things, and how does this interact with the environment? One thing to kind of just step back at, again, I'm an economist, just to talk about externalities. Externalities, we define that as these benefits or costs that the market doesn't price. So for example, if I pollute and that imposes costs on others in the community, but I don't have to pay for it, something's wrong. The market doesn't function as it should. And that's really kind of what we're doing here. Greenhouse gas emissions are associated with climate variation. Climate variation is a very troubling prospect for many different parts of civilization. Agricultural production is certainly part of that. We're all concerned about what an ever-varying climate might mean to agricultural production, especially in our region, in the north central region here. And so that's really one of these drivers. And so if we can price these externalities, this is kind of an economist's dream, if we can price these externalities, let's do it. And that will help the market operate more efficiently. Society will operate more efficiently. We'll be able to get people what they want, produce it in a way that we want, and not necessarily impose these external costs, in this case, environmental costs, on others in the region. So this is, kind of the key, but it's also neat to sit back and realize that sometimes you can hit two birds with one stone. So in this case, we're talking about, hey, what if I look at my refinery or my crop production for a farmer through this environmental lens and say, okay, these are the inputs I use, these are the processes I use, and these are some of the environmental outcomes. It's like, well, the state of California has told me that these things, these greenhouse gas emissions, are not desirable. Let's look at that. Well, maybe I should change the way that I do things, make a tweak in my current system, make an investment, use new capital, change the business to reduce, in this case, greenhouse gas emissions. But what's really cool is in a lot of cases when you're making that change, there's other benefits. Probably first and foremost, be interested in financial benefits so that you could actually increase profits as you're doing this, so that the revenue you might see is greater than the financial expenditures. That's great. Or there might be other environmental benefits. Again, really, really key to this. And we see this in a lot of cases, again, just by changing your perspective, by looking through that environmental lens, you can find things that are both economically, financially profitable, better for the firm, and better for the environment. And there's a common phrase for this, which is called doing good while doing well. That is, we're doing good for others, we're addressing these environmental concerns, and we're making some money. Just to dive a little bit into where the markets are in California. So they have a functioning market. So you have the folks who use fuel that has a smaller carbon intensity than's mandated, and some who have use fuel that's a little bit higher. They trade, and in that trade, the credit, which is that difference, produces this price. And that price is a signal for folks to avoid using fuels that have a big greenhouse gas footprint and to use those that don't. And so right now, as I said, the price is about $200 a metric ton, which to you, again, might just be this nebulous number. It doesn't have a lot of meaning. But again, just take my word for it, it's big. It's more than enough for people to sit up. And we've seen this across the board, especially in corn ethanol refineries in the Great Plains, including Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, because we have transportation advantages into California. And so that's great. We have these transportation advantages. We're already in that market. And now California is saying, hey, if you make these incremental changes, we'll pay you 3, 5, 10 cents more per gallon for every gallon you send to us, because we think it's valuable to have lower carbon fuels. And that's what you essentially see at this $200 metric ton level. That translates into these changes or these incentives on a per gallon basis, in the pennies, but in the pennies across tens or hundreds of millions of gallons for each refinery is more than enough for them to document what they're doing that might be good, or to implement changes that can result in those reductions. One of the problems, and this has kind of been nagging at me for a year and a half. So I'm in North Dakota. North Dakota is not a traditional corn state, although I certainly argue that the southeastern part of the state is in the Corn Belt. We're not quite Iowa where it's corn, and soybeans. We still have a little bit of variation, but it is a dominant crop. It's the third largest crop in our state by acreage, and arguably second by the size of its actual economic impact. But what California does, and which is not good, is they call all corn from the Midwest corn. And so it doesn't matter if my refinery is in North Dakota or Iowa, the carbon intensity for every bushel of corn that goes into a refinery has the same greenhouse gas footprint. And that's not true. There's a lot of ways in which you can have a much larger, much smaller footprint for any particular bushel. Mostly we think that it's driven by yield. So if I have extremely productive land, I might do exactly the same thing and have yields that are 20, 25 bushels higher than another field that just isn't as productive. Well, the greenhouse gas intensity of that more productive field for every bushel is smaller because you can divide by that bigger number. At the same time, we do see variations in how things are produced. More or less fertilizer, more or less field activity, and probably most importantly now is more or less tillage. Again, because that really has an impact, partially because of fuel use, but most importantly is because we can actually sequester a large amount of carbon, which is a great way essentially for agriculture to serve as a sink of that material. So just to kind of dive into that a little bit more is just to look at what no-till or conservation till, alternative tillage could mean to farmers who market into refineries that then market their ethanol into California. And so, as I mentioned, that this future is probably one of the most promising ways in which we can capitalize, take advantage of this low carbon mindset. Again, I talked about how Midwestern corn is like this single homogeneous product when it's really not. But let's just think for a second, well, what if I had in a given county, a farmer who does no-till and a farmer who does conventional till? There's going to be differences across the board in the things that they do, but most importantly from a carbon standpoint is that by practicing no-till, that farmer is going to sequester a tremendous amount of carbon, every year that it's practiced. And again, it's kind of important to note, and California is really interested in what I'm going to call permanent no-till, making a true change in philosophy and practice. So this land is permanently in no-till, as opposed to limited tillage practices in a kind of irregular manner where in a given year you don't till as much as you would, but over time you're going to and lose all of those benefits. But just kind of give you an understanding of the magnitudes we're talking about, and the numbers aren't precisely known, but just using, for example, if we can sequester 400 pounds of CO2 per acre in a year at that $200 per metric ton price, we're talking about $35 an acre. So if we can get to that point, and there's a lot of folks working that way, where California provides that $200 per metric ton incentive via their low carbon fuel standard policy, that gets pushed back to a corn ethanol refinery in the plains. That corn ethanol refinery contracts and traces no-till corn back to the farmer. That farmer arguably could capture as much as $35 per acre per year. And again, kind of stepping back, think of that value proposition as a farmer. One, he may already be practicing no-till, and so he gets an additional kind of free incentive of $35 an acre. Or it might be a farmer who's right on the edge saying, I've thought about it, but there's that yield drag maybe the first couple of years. Or I might have to change my equipment or my operations. But that $35 incentive might be more than enough, in many cases would be more than enough to kind of tip the scale so that they could go and practice no-till. And if you think about it, the farmer benefits, the state of California benefits, and now it really is that incentive all the way through the system to kind of make that external benefit an internal benefit back to that corn farmer. So now one of the questions is, well, what's missing? Why aren't we doing this? Well, I visited with ARB quite a bit, not as much as EPA, but they want to, if they're going to say that Midwestern corn is different, they don't want to go from Midwestern corn, which is all corn grown in a multi-state region. They want to go straight to the field level. They want to be able to track field level greenhouse gas emissions. So not only CO2, but other greenhouse gases, especially nitrous oxide. And that's not easy to do. And I work with some soil scientists here on campus. Not easy to do, but somewhat doable. But there has to be additional work, innovation being done in that space. And what we're seeing is that California is supportive of that, but it's actually US DOE who's going to finance a lot of that activity. And so that's what we're really starting to see in the last 8 months. US DOE, especially ARPA-E, which is the Advanced Research Project Administration for Energy, has set aside a significant amount of money to help develop these systems to track carbon. At the same time, the private sector has been really involved in this. So in some ways, really kind of as silent actors, at least us, those of us in the land grant system. There's a lot of nonprofits and private businesses. So this is Environmental Defense Fund, Natural Resource Defense Council, World Wildlife Fund. You know, for years, they've been involved in working to address certain environmental challenges, sometimes in partnership with land grants and other universities, oftentimes not. But that's kind of where we sit. And then what we're really seeing now is the private sector, the private businesses, primarily multinational agribusinesses, are very interested in ecosystem services, carbon to some extent, but all of the different ecosystem services, and that they're willing to dedicate significant resources to support all of us being better actors in the environment. The only thing I would say that in light of all of this is that interest was extremely high. There was a lot of activity prior to the pandemic. And now the question is kind of where are we at and how interested are policymakers, citizens, consumers, and the private sector in making these kind of changes. Just mention really quickly 2 coordinating agencies, those who kind of work in this ecosystem market space. So Field of Market's been around for a number of years. They are a coordinating agency. They work with a number of nonprofits, multinational agribusinesses, land-grant universities primarily to track what's going on with the environment. So they have a tool that essentially allows a farmer to see how they're impacting the environment on a field level basis, not incentivizing anything, but tracking. They also work with a number of their partners to have demonstration projects to demonstrate how certain practices across the board might benefit the environment. And then one of the new groups is this Ecosystem Markets Services Consortium, which is primarily multinational egg companies, and they're interested in these same things, but they really want to create new markets, similar to what the California Air Resources Board does with agriculture, which, you know, with what they do with carbon, but to extend that to other things. And they're a fledgling organization, a little over a year old, but very well backed, very motivated, and this is their space. Some additional supporting things, you might have caught this, has now already been 2 months, which seems like years ago. The Secretary of Ag came out and said USDA is interested in developing programs that support carbon management, ecosystem services broadly. So this came out on, I think, on a Tuesday or Wednesday, and by Thursday, there was a little bit of there's some backtracking in this, saying, well, not completely, not really, who knows exactly what it meant. But we do know that the USDA and Secretary Perdue are very familiar with this and do see it as an opportunity for agriculture to improve the sustainability of actual, farmers and ranchers, and to increase the environmental sustainability of agricultural lands and different ecosystems. So to me, I saw that as really promising, although the backtracking a day or two later shouldn't have been surprising, but is kind of disappointing. At the same time, a group that I didn't talk about, and the best example of this is Indigo Ag. So, a private company that is out there visiting with farmers saying, we will pay you on a per acre basis for denoting that your land is in our program, and we will pay you X amount of dollars. $15 an acre if you're a no-till farmer. Then we're going to serve kind of as that marketplace, and then go out to private businesses and sell that to sell essentially that credit that you've produced by saying, I am practicing these things. A lot of work to be done. It's still a private system. It's contractual. It's not enforced. It's not necessarily validated. But again, a definite demonstration primarily from those folks who are giving money to Indigo Ag that they see this as important to them. And again, is this a branding thing? Is this a greenwashing, if you will? Possibly, but it does have that true economic impact. Finally, too, it's not just carbon. Carbon is the gorilla. It gets most of the attention, but it's certainly only one of the many dimensions in which agriculture impacts the environment, or that biofuels impact the environment, or animal production impacts the environment and ecosystems. But it's really important because we have this system that works. We can look to California, know that today it is driving innovation in the biofuel sector, knowing that there's a number of parties, private, public, at the state and federal level, trying to build these markets and these programs for carbon, knowing they can be readily extended to other environmental dimensions. I think, to me, it's really promising. So now the problem, though, is like, well, what's next? And so what I just gave you was the talk that I would have given in its entirety, 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago, but now we have COVID-19. And this has dramatically impacted all of our lives. You guys got to see my 3-year-old, which is just, exciting for you. That's like value added. We should add her as a panelist for this. But it's impacted all of our lives, and in many cases in a negative way. So right now we see households being impacted, some in different way, every household being impacted in a different way, and some experiencing some extreme duress. A lot of uncertainty, a decline in incomes, a decline in wealth. That is going to change how we approach the environment. How that is actually going to happen remains to be seen. But that's kind of why I wanted to talk about these things for the last few minutes. Private business is seeing a lot of disruptions, again, varying from industry to industry. In agriculture, we're seeing disruptions in the supply chain. We're seeing those in the corn ethanol business, where about half of our capacity is offline right now. More than a third of it closed, a third of it running at low capacity. How is that going to come back online? And then finally, right now, all of the political attention, for the most part, especially at the federal level, is going to, well, how do we address the spread of the disease, of the virus? And then how do we preserve the economy as best we can? How do we maintain households? How do we maintain small businesses? How do we prevent this, severe and continued disruption in how things work? And we see that, in the ag economy, they're intervening, trying to find ways to keep the system from completely tipping over. And so then kind of my question for all of us, and it might be a bit rhetorical, is, where do we go from here? If you would have asked me 2 months ago, I had a pretty good understanding, or I would have been much more confident in my vision of what was going to happen in this space in the next 5 to 10 years. And that would have been research and development, supporting an expansion of these policies, initially state by state and perhaps eventually at the federal level, for private businesses to continue to dedicate significant resources to support, new ecosystem service markets. I think that was a given. Now I'm not so sure. The economy will recover. How fast and how long will it take to us get to where we were? That remains to be seen. It's going to take a long time, and it will never be as it was, when we started this. The value of most assets are going to recover, but not all of them. A lot of families are not going to be in the place where they were. They're going to experience, severe displacement. What does that mean? And again, as I've kind of mentioned too, is a lot of these businesses are going to never come back. And then just kind of thinking about where ecosystem services are, in some respect, they're a luxury. You have to put food on the table before you worry too much about the environment. You have to worry about, making your shareholders relatively happy before you can say, okay, the environment is important. And so then one of my questions is, what does all of this change mean for consumer behavior and for voter preferences? Because those are really the two big drivers. I could add investor interest. Those are the drivers to say, how much do we care about the environment to some extent, but probably more importantly is how much are we willing to spend today or in the near term to address these issues? And that I really don't know. But that was what I had to share. Happy to answer any questions, any discussion you might have. Feel free to, we can have part of the conversation here, but if you have any additional questions in the future, don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Ripplinger. I'll let you catch your breath here for a second. And
Thanks.
And at least I'm not the only one that has kids running in and out. So you handled it much better than I did. I probably would have yelled at one of them. So you did a good job. So kudos to you for that.
Well, thank you.
So anyway, so I'm going to pop up the last poll there, but we do have some questions already that have kind of chimed in through the beginning. So I'll kind of go through some of those, and some of them may be a little easier, some may be harder to answer. So I'll just kind of pop down here. Angie asked a question about the transportation costs. Are the transportation costs of biofuels per BTU to California factored into the market cost? So I think getting it there.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So the carbon intensity of any fuel in California is delivered to California. So that is factored into that carbon footprint. In terms of the actual cost to consumers, there is a cost to deliver to California, so that's represented in the market price. And then when you actually talk about going from the wholesale level to the retail level, there's a number of factors that are going to impact price. Ethanol right now, and if there's maybe a secondary thing you can take from this right now, is ethanol is not a fuel in this country right now. It's a fuel additive. We don't use it because of its energy content. We use it because it provides octane. Completely different things. And the reason ethanol has found a nice place to this point in the fuel blend is because it's significantly less expensive than other sources of octane. And it has, a lot of environmental benefits, but the dollars and cents thing is what drives it into those markets. Now what we're seeing, and again, even in California, with the low carbon fuel standard, we don't see proliferation of E15 or E85 or anything. It's really instead saying, okay, for that E10 that's used, how green can we get it in light of all of these other market considerations? And so, on a BTU basis, ethanol is extremely expensive right now because the price of gasoline has plummeted. As an octane source, up until recently, it has been by far the lower cost option. And then going into California where they sit, ethanol as part of the blend has an even more important role, again, because on that BTU basis, it's on an energy equivalent basis. The amount of emissions is significantly lower than gasoline. For some of the more advanced plants, those who might be extremely well engineered, or some who may have adopted new technology, because of the low carbon fuel standard, their greenhouse gas emissions are 40% or half of what gasoline is. So on an energy equivalent basis, their footprint is much smaller. Okay,
thanks. Another question, given the recent pandemic triggered low transportation fuel use, many biorefineries may go through bankruptcy. How do you envision, one, how farmers may respond, and two, the future of biofuel industry? And
that's the question. Okay, I mean, so we've seen this, and we're now far enough into this disruption caused by COVID that we know what's going to happen. Gasoline use in this country has fallen by half. There's nothing even close to this this situation. After the financial recession, the financial debacle in 2008, gasoline use fell by 10% over the course of months and quarters and years. Here it's fallen by half in a little over a month. And I mean, we know this anecdotally. I mean, when is the last time any of us have refilled our vehicles? For me, it's going on 6 weeks, and we have one vehicle that we fill up. The other one I have to take out for a spin, or it's gonna suffer. But again, we've seen what's happened. The question is, what happens in the future? Yes, I mean, there's a number of corn ethanol refineries that are going to have to be financially restructured. That's a given. There are probably some corn ethanol plants that will never reopen. And that's just kind of where we sit. The big question would be is how quickly does gasoline and ethanol use recover? And my thought would be relatively slowly. How fast do we reopen the economy? And then as it reopens, how do people actually drive? If you don't have to drive to work, you might not drive. If you can't drive to your favorite vacation spot, you might not drive. If you're concerned about, spreading the illness or contracting the virus, you may shop a whole lot less. And so all of those things are questions or situations we just don't even know. There's no frame of reference. And so, gasoline use probably can't go down much further, assuming that the economy doesn't collapse. But how quickly it will recover, we don't know. But it's going to take time. And again, things will always be, they will be different. I don't have the chart here, but, with that production falling by half, we have all of this unused capacity and we have built up stocks, and to go back to and through all of that is going to take a lot of time. And I think it really remains to be seen what will happen. Probably the biggest challenge, or this is the biggest threat to agriculture right now, and I'm not lobbying or advocating in any way, but right now there's a huge fight in terms of the renewable fuel standard, which does mandate use between the petroleum industry and the agricultural sector, ethanol, corn, saying, are we going to keep those mandates where they were, knowing that we're going to use a lot less gasoline? And if they keep those mandates in place, E15 will come very, very quickly. So if E15 comes and gasoline use recovers, but it's not E10, it's E15, we could be back up to where we were a lot quicker. If, on the other hand, the petroleum industry prevails and says, ethanol use can be way down here, that loss may never be, be recovered. It might be that thing where they point back and say, okay, it will be E10 tops as an octane provider ever. And so that type of discussion hasn't been top of the list generally in the ag news. But it's probably the most critical thing for agriculture to worry about, again, because a third of our corn acres go to ethanol. And if we end up losing, half of that permanently, we have 15 million extra acres that we need to find a home for. And, unless we find a use, and maybe crop production isn't the best use, or for that next acre isn't that best use, there will be a significant and long-term crisis facing agriculture.
Okay, got a few more that popped up in here, and Angie has a question. She says, more than a decade of research in Illinois showed that crop production itself, disturbing the soil at all actually results in CO2 loss. And the only way to actually sequester carbon is to combine no-till with cover crops. Is there an interest in factoring in the value of these two practices together, at least in the California market and maybe others?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that there's what I'm going to call introductory science. This is great news for all of us, is that to really support with the level of scientific rigor that EPA wants, or most especially in this case that California wants, we need to do a whole bunch more research. And no-till alone may or may not get us there, but it's all of those those practices, cover crops alone, cover crops in tandem with no-till, what does it actually do? And, we've had a lot of really good soil scientists. We've done a lot of really good research. The truth is, at least for what those groups want, we're nowhere close. And so, with them pushing back, I would expect that if this remains an important issue for them, that we will see a dramatic increase in that type of research. And again, I can't speak specifically to any of it. I do work with some of our, our soil scientists and agronomists here, our cover crop plant scientists. I work with them a lot. Yeah, and again, too, if you sit back, this is a cropping system issue. It's not a simple, hey, we're going to do this or do that. It's everything in tandem. If you're going to grow in rotation, how are you going to do it? So all of those things become really, really important. In this case, hey, it's really nice because that supports continued and maybe increased agricultural research, including at land grants.
Okay, thanks. Question here. Can you unpack the concern that we are subsidizing the growth of food or corn, burning it to create energy through biomass, the inefficiency of using large swaths of land for this purpose, and the impact on grassland ecosystems as a result of that? So basically stepping back and looking at it as a system, whether this is a sustainable policy.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so, really broadly speaking, on the carbon side, when you do that life cycle assessment, you do consider those secondary impacts, that land use change issue. You do consider runoff. You do consider those things. Considering just carbon or greenhouse gases, it's better, but there are certainly costs. But again, if you think about it, maybe this gets to that bigger ecosystem market services idea is, if we have a significant amount of nitrogen runoff, that's not good. But that's not necessarily priced completely in California's model or EPA's model. And those are things that we need to get to. And I think that, I think that we'll slowly get there. And I know that, this intensive agriculture, extensive agriculture certainly is an interface between us and the environment. And that carbon is just one piece of that. And again, going back to that EPA slide, it's not just like the diesel fuel I used or the nitrogen fertilizer I used. It's everything I used and the way in which I used it, which all lead to that number. And important to note, it does include that land use impact, be it CRP conversion, here in the Northern Plains, or new land put into agricultural production in Brazil. I mean, that's part of the picture. And what I would say is that we're getting closer to considering these other factors formally, but we still have a long way to go.
Okay, question here. Is there any role for biobutanol as a drop-in replacement fuel down the road?
Good question. Yeah, so biobutanol is, it's going to be a renewable form of butanol, which drop in. So I can just throw it into the gas tank and it's fuel. It works. I don't have to do anything with the engine. I've worked with a few folks in that space. A lot of research has gone into that. A lot of commercial work has gone into that, and it still hasn't happened. I would be more pessimistic today than I was 2 months ago because the price of gasoline is a third of what it was. And so now you're saying, okay, that's a fuel. In this case, if we're talking about biobutanol as a fuel, that has to compete with 70-cent gasoline. That's a stretch. That being said, I think, continued interest and support of kind of the all of the above is still helpful because economics do change. But I would say in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be a hard push.
Okay, just a couple questions in here I'll address real quick, and then I'll get back to a few more. This webinar is recorded and will be posted at northcentralclimate.org. So if you're wanting access to this later, I know there's a couple people that posted questions about that, so you can refer back to it there. So we'll go down the line here. Got another one from Gary. In the future, could no-till farmers get paid $35 per acre without corn ethanol with a California program?
Yes. Yeah. So not via the California program, but it would demonstrate, again, so what you have is a market which is saying, based on this is what the price is. And the Purdue announcement was not saying we're going to use the low carbon fuel standard. The Purdue announcement was basically saying, you know what? These environmental benefits are real and significant. And if they are true and significant, it doesn't necessarily have to be a market-driven policy coming back via corn and via ethanol and via corn. Why would we not as a society just sit down and say, hey, we are going to direct $30 billion a year to folks who practice crop production in these ways? To get to that, and this goes back to point two, I don't think that'll be on the table anytime soon. But that's certainly part of the vision. Again, markets can be very, very efficient in addressing some of these things, but it's certainly not the only way for us to address these externalities. And so there's a lot of research that helps us get to what those values are. And, it could almost just as soon be scientific research that says the value is this, and the federal government writes a check. Or, what we're seeing too, it could almost just as likely maybe, in that realm where private businesses say that, where a Cargill says, you know what, if you practice no-till or conservation till, or, can produce this much corn with less nitrogen fertilizer, we'll write you a check. That's what Indigo Egg is doing. Indigo Egg is not, it's a completely private setup. So there's different ways to address this. For me, I'm most excited about California ethanol, California low carbon fuel standards because it's happening. We can sit here and kind of wish and think about how things might work, but I mean, there you have a great case. With Indigo A, you have a private case. With Purdue saying it, you have a public case. It's exciting. And again, with USDA, I would say that if USDA does become actively involved in ecosystem, and we do this already, right? We have various payment programs already in place. It would essentially be saying, okay, these benefits are a whole lot bigger than what we've been giving you through NRCS. We're going to take NRCS's budget and multiply it by 10 or by 50 because that's the environmental benefit that we jointly see.
Okay, got a question here, maybe more in your wheelhouse of ag economics, back to the roots, right? Someone said that they had read that the rapid growth of COVID-19 in urban settings, followed by a slight decrease and now a slightly delayed rapid growth in rural areas. How will this delayed yet impacting phenomenon be realized in ag economics?
I'm not an epidemiologist, right? We've got a classic mess. It's something that we really don't have experience with. There is discussion of, and I think too, and we're seeing this, Montana's opened up. They opened up today. South Dakota has the hot spot in the country at their Smithfield processing plant. I think it's going to be a community by community situation, and it will take a community by community response. We're certainly, one of the things we realize from this is that we're all connected. And so I just don't know, exactly how we're going to get through this. I'm much more comfortable being in a less populated, less dense area, because I'm just going to bump into fewer people. At the same time, I really don't know. But I'm taking precautions.
Okay, one here, a question. Wouldn't a carbon tax on crude oil raise the price of gasoline, making alternative fuels more competitive given the current low prices? It seems like this is a major externalized cost we're avoiding.
Yeah, so I mean, it's the different side of the same coin. So basically right now what California has said is we will incentivize low carbon fuel. But what's interesting is it's all relative to gasoline. So they basically said, the average has to be so many megajoules, so many grams of CO2 emitted per megajoule, and it's got to decline. But they don't say it could be gasoline. It could be diesel. It could be something else. It could be coal-generated electricity. They're not prescriptive. They're just saying, we think that carbon emissions are bad. We're concerned about climate variation. Carbon emissions are bad. It's got to be this level, and then this level, and then this level. And so because it's not prescriptive, early on it was, it's almost entirely gasoline and diesel and a little bit of ethanol, a little bit of biodiesel. And now it's more ethanol, more biodiesel, but electricity can work in there, XYZ. It's up to the market to decide that, not for the folks in Sacramento to decide it. But again, it's that traditional amount of emissions per megajoule of gasoline that we're concerned about, and that's the thing they're trying to get away from. Again, but it could still be part of the mix. Again, the gasoline that I fill up with has a smaller greenhouse gas footprint than the gas I used however many years ago, but they're still primarily gas. And again, one of the nice things about that too is it gives you time to transition. It does not have to be, it does not have to be this or this, because truth be told, no matter how good the science is, we might screw up.
Never.
Yeah.
So a couple questions here from Chris. What might the impact the depressed, you kind of answered maybe a little bit of this, what might the impact the depressed price on oil blended gasoline have on transitioning to bioenergy or low carbon? Is it a blip or a possible accelerator?
Yeah, so it's tough for two reasons. And really the gist is energy is cheap. Fossil fuel-based energy is really, really cheap. And so how are you going to replace that? Biofuels are, on an energy equivalent basis are more expensive. And now they're relatively even more expensive. And so that's tough. I mean, how do you go to a taxpayer or how do you go to a consumer and say, hey, this is better for the environment, but you're going to have to spend an extra 50 cents a gallon. That's a tough push. At the same time, just collectively, how do we, with different budget pressures we're going to have at the federal level, how are they going to come out and say, well, we're going to invest in renewables? Why are biofuels important? And you can go back to the RFS. It was energy security, it was rural economies, it was the environment that pushed it. It was concern that we were running out of oil. It's not what happened. If you go back to 2014-15 with the previous oil decline, I'm in North Dakota, so I mean, for us, that was a bust. And you saw an immediate reduction in the interest of folks wanting to invest in near commercial or even distant commercial biofuels. It's just a much, much harder thing to do, again, because what you're trying to replace is so much cheaper.
Okay, another question here. What do you know, or do you know who is working on forest biomass like wood chips for bioenergy electricity?
Yeah, so there's a few folks. I mean, the biggest push is that, there was Washington State, University of Washington had a big push. Penn State had a big push. Southeast a little bit had a good sized push. All of these were consortiums. Wood chips, and it's a completely different story. And I've actually worked probably disproportionately in woody biomass, being from North Dakota. But there's unique opportunities for wood as a feedstock for electricity generation. And we see this because we have exported hundreds of thousands of metric tons of woody biomass from the United States to Europe to help them achieve their greenhouse gas emission goals. Not so much up here. North Dakota side, we have no trees. Minnesota side, too far from port. But, much of the Southeast, the Pacific Northwest, especially British Columbia, they've been hitting that all day. And it's interesting. And again, it goes back to that interest in the environment, in greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. They're looking for a fuel that works, and that fuel is woody biomass. In terms of dedicated things, I mean, that was a lot of what that earlier round of bioenergy research was. And so that was primarily, dedicated energy crops, kind of in that space.
Okay, another one here kind of builds on that, and this person is particularly interested in wood-based resources. But what are the other prospects for cellulosic sources other than corn? Then they also say they're curious how other bioproducts like plastics might influence the market for cellulosic resources.
Yeah, I mean, so if you look, and USDA's done a lot of research on this. If you look at what they wanted to do with the RFS, and they have a really nice roadmap, and with the billion-ton study, it was cellulosic corn stover. That was really kind of like an entry thing, and then we would move towards dedicated crops, woody biomass, all of those things. Truth be told, it's tough to do. I'm an economist, right? So if it hasn't been done, there must be a reason why we haven't picked up that penny yet. And I'm relatively well versed of what's been done in those spaces. A lot of it is that front end handling of getting this material into a refinery, and being able to do that at industrial scale is just really difficult. But USDA has invested a lot of money. The private sector invested quite a bit of money. Every land grant, was engaged to some extent with kind of their own regional perspective. And so we certainly looked at it. For me, starch, corn starch works really well because we can convert starch to sugar to alcohol really easily. Sugar to alcohol really easy. With cellulose, you're trying to take something that nature said, hey, this is for structure and defense, and treat it as food. And so a lot of those things, it's just a little bit too far. And for the most part, a lot of those projects, and again, a lot was invested in the last 15 years, have really come to a standstill, and it'd be even more difficult to sell when gasoline is less than $1. Like USDOE, especially like the national labs, I mean, their target was $3. If they could get cellulosic to $3 per gallon of gasoline equivalent, they'd be okay with it. Right now, that's not going to happen, and it's not $3 per gallon of gas. It's $1.20 at the retail level, and probably, maybe half that at the rack.
Okay, looks like we just have a few more questions here. Has anyone quantified the ecosystem benefits of other best management practices besides no-till, such as cover crops in ethanol production? And which metrics are in use? They mentioned here Comet or Optus. I'm not familiar with that one, but what metrics might they use to quantify those types of benefits?
Yeah, and so within this work to quantify, I mean, you're really looking at it's a life cycle assessment, and so it might be in tandem with this change in a cropping system, and so I'm not even familiar specifically with much work on the role of cover crops in ethanol, although I'm sure it's out there. This is an area that's ripe for research, and for a number of reasons. One, it's important. And the role of carbon sequestration. And I think probably the most important reason is these are complex systems. And, to do even like a 3 or a 5 year study, and I'm talking about a robust study, it only moves the ball so far. There's so much that would need to be done in terms of, what does the cover crop system look like? How does that relate to the broader, the rest of the crop rotation? What types of soils, what type of climate, what do you experience while you're doing these trials? There's so much there. And I would use that and think somewhat optimistically, again, because DOE and USDA are having these conversations, because energy remains a very important topic to DOE. How do you go out and explain to them, for them to come to you with a whole lot of money to do this type of stuff? I know it's coming, maybe not as much as it was 2 months ago, but there's a lot that needs to be done. Again, the LCA thing, it's a different science. It's an engineering discipline. It's not difficult to master because it's a process. The system that California uses, which has kind of become the ubiquitous go-to, is called GREET, which is a tool that the Argonne National Labs put together. That's where you go for this stuff. And so you wouldn't necessarily use an existing model or systems from outside of LCAs. You do your work, use your model, and then take that same data from that model and put it into GREET or to a different LCA software.
Okay, question here. Are there concerns about policy goals of 100% clean energy and zero carbon emissions in the near future?
So it depends. So on a state-by-state basis, zero carbon is very doable, but that's really not zero carbon. So some states, we can make investments in a lot of low carbon power generation. And what you really see too is wind and solar are very inexpensive on their face today. Close to, if not less than natural gas, which is obviously a carbon-based thing, substantially less than new coal and probably less than existing coal. And so, that's what we're seeing in the last, 3 years, especially a dramatic build out in solar, a dramatic build out in wind, obviously a similar build out in natural gas. Coal is being retired, for whatever's left is being retired really quickly. But to get to that, that clean, to get that zero carbon score, there's a lot of different things that go into building a system that achieves the goals you want, because you want it to be cheap, you want it to be clean, but you want it to be reliable, and you need redundancies. And one of the nice redundancies of having different generating units is that they oftentimes work better in different situations. If the wind's not blowing, I can fire up my natural gas power plant. If it's not sunny, I can do this. If this part of the country goes down, I can do that. And so for any particular state to do it, it is not that difficult. And I would say too, for any state to do it is not a huge economic hardship. If states want to move that way, it's to say that everybody's going to do it. That's going to be a little bit more difficult if you want to have all of those other things that we all expect from our power, which means when I turn on the switch, the light goes on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Question, once the economy recovers, how likely will the California market get saturated and prices fall? So I don't quite understand. What is the fuel market? If you can expand. Yeah, let's see if they're still on, maybe they can chime in there and then answer that. I don't know if it's for the carbon market, if that's maybe what they're referencing.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the concerns. So right now, I mean, we have an abundance of ethanol, which is a low carbon fuel. And so clearly the premium for that has gone down because we have so much of it. The same thing with biodiesel, which is a very low carbon fuel. Again, we kind of have this abundance. And so, as that demand has fallen, the price of everything goes down. So you have a lot more flexibility as a buyer. As California opens up, I think they'll still have the capability. It's also really important too to note that California is an extremely regulated market. They have extremely high state taxes on gasoline. They have certain blend requirements because of their geographic setup. I mean, it's an expensive place to buy gas no matter what. And so, it'll be interesting to see how that all works out as they come back. And I'm less than optimistic about California opening up than I was 3 days ago before everybody went to the beach. So that's going to be an interesting story in and of itself.
Okay. How much progress has been made in the last 5 years in improving the viability of algal biofuels?
Yeah. So algae, I'm not an algae guy. Algae is very unique. There's ongoing investment, There are a couple larger projects in New Mexico. A lot of folks thought things were going and rolling. And, obviously there's no commercial production right now. It's an interesting platform. I know a lot of folks who are, in that business and very optimistic. Algae is a very unique organism you can do a lot of neat stuff with. But clearly we aren't there. And again, if you just think, and this kind of goes back to Chris's question, the incentive from the market to innovate in this renewable space has just collapsed. Again, because we're up to our eyeballs in gasoline. We're up to our eyeballs in ethanol from corn. We're up to our eyeballs in biodiesel. We don't need that next new thing. And truth is, if you're an investor, I couldn't sit there and look at future prices and say, in 5 years, like right when we come online, there'll be a market for this. Because in 5 years, I'm not sure where gasoline use will be, where gasoline demand and the demand for other renewable fuels would be. And so it makes everything really tough.
Okay. I don't see any more questions, but I have one that I've been saving, and maybe you can answer. So given this whole pandemic, what opportunity do you see coming out of this from maybe things that we've learned from people's actions, from what air quality looks like? What do you see as maybe the next either opportunity or step, or maybe something that we can do to continue that benefit that maybe we've seen there?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. I think the best example of that, or the anecdotal evidence of that, is you can actually see a blue sky in the Los Angeles basin, right? So, I mean, they have terrifically horrible air quality issues in large part because of geography. And they've probably seen a blue sky for the first time in 70 years. I think that's going to be tough to give up. I don't know. And we see a lot of these measures, obviously emissions are down. A lot of those little environmental indicators are fun. You're walking around, you're seeing critters where you haven't seen critters before. I think that it does kind of reopen ourselves to what could be or what was. And I think too is, this is a chance for us to look at how we do a lot of things, for us to revisit, what's important to us, how do we actually move forward? And it's actually, to me, that's certainly silver lining, is in some cases, because there's going to be such structural change, some of which that we get to control, that, now is a time to revisit the things that we think are important, and then how do we get there? One of the things I've done, going back and looking at the collapse after the financial fiasco a decade ago, it really wasn't supportive of new environmental initiatives. But that doesn't mean that, you give up. But there's going to be significant changes, and especially agriculture. I mean, I think that we've shown that, what we did and how we were doing things was extremely efficient from a, productivity standpoint, but maybe not the way we want to do things. There's not much resilience. There's a lot of risk. And so I don't know, exactly how things might be, but now's a good time to sit back and say, okay, these are the things that are important to us and this is what we want to do. But again, going back to one of my last slides, is politically, people are going to want to eat. And so that's going to come first. But maybe my glimmer of hope is that I think that that the economy will be able to slowly open up starting now. And in some places it'll have to close again or retract back. But now is a great opportunity to kind of sit down and say, okay, here's our priorities. This is how we want to move forward. And it's also a chance too for us as agricultural scientists to revisit all these things. And I think a lot of us has done that. We're stuck at home and, you get a little bit more chance to drink coffee because you're not driving to work. And, what are we going to do differently?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I think we've all had those thoughts for sure. Yeah, so that's the last question. It was a very good discussion, a lot of interest, obviously. My really last question is a couple of people wanted to know if you'd be willing to share your slides with this, or if just
sure.
Okay, we can then I'll just get the PDF from you and we'll attach that to the same place we put this recording, which will be on northcentralclimate.org. So with that, that's all we have. Thanks, Dr. Ripplinger. Appreciate you and your family contributing to the webinar today. So certainly enjoyed it, and a lot of positive comments in the chat. So thanks again for helping out.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Okay. Have a nice day, everyone. Enjoy your afternoon. Take care.